The night Lyora Vale disappeared from Thornridge Estate, the servants whispered that even the sea fell silent. For 3 years she'd been invisible, a wife in name only, dismissed as fragile, replaceable, nothing more than warm breath in cold halls. But when she walked out into the winter storm without a word, without permission, without looking back, she did what no woman in that brutal coastal world had ever dared. She chose herself over survival. And Elias Thornridge, the man who thought he controlled everything, realized too late that the only thing he couldn't afford to lose was the one thing he'd never bothered to keep. If you want to see how a forgotten woman rewrites her fate and breaks a man who thought he was unbreakable, stay until the end. Drop a like, tell us where you're watching from, and let's dive in. The storm came in hard the night Lyora arrived at Thornridge. She'd been warned about the wind, about how it tore through the cliffs like something hungry, how it rattled the bones of the old estate and made even the strongest men uneasy. But no one had warned her about the silence inside. The carriage jolted to a stop in the courtyard, rain hammering against the roof like fists demanding entry. Lyora gripped the edge of her seat, her knuckles bone white, her breath coming in short, shallow pulls. Through the streaked glass, she could see the house, if you could call it that. Thornridge wasn't a home. It was a fortress, stone and iron and gray, rising out of the cliffs like it had been carved from the same rock that held back the sea. No warmth in the windows. No light except the cold flicker of lanterns swaying in the wind, their flames guttering like they were barely holding on. "This is it, miss," the driver said, his voice rough as gravel. He didn't look at her. No one had looked at her much since the arrangements were made. Not her father, not the solicitor who'd drawn up the papers, not even the priest who'd blessed a union that felt more like a transaction than a marriage. Lyora nodded, though her throat was tight enough to choke her. She gathered her cloak around her shoulders, thin wool, already soaked through, and stepped out into the rain. The cold hit her like a physical blow. She stumbled, catching herself against the carriage door, and for a moment she just stood there, water soaking through her dress, her hair plastered to her face, the wind trying to shove her back toward the road she'd just traveled. The house loomed ahead, dark and indifferent, its windows like dead eyes. Somewhere inside, her husband was waiting. A man she'd met twice. A man who'd looked at her during their brief courtship, if you could call 2 stiff conversations over tea a courtship, like she was a chair he was considering buying. Functional. Unremarkable. Temporary. That word still burned in her chest like acid. Temporary. "Move along, then," the driver muttered, already unhitching the horses. His hands moved fast, eager to be gone. "They don't like waiting." Lyora forced her legs to move. Each step felt like wading through water. The front door swung open before she reached it, and a woman stepped out, older, stern-faced, her gray hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. She wore black from neck to ankle, her dress severe and practical, and she held a lantern that threw harsh shadows across her face. "You're late," the woman said. Not unkind, but not warm either, just factual, like she was noting the weather. "The roads were, I don't need excuses. I'm Mrs. Callan. I manage the house. You'll follow my instructions, stay out of the way, and do what's expected of you. Understood?" Lyora nodded, her voice caught somewhere between her ribs and her throat, tangled up with all the things she wanted to say, but couldn't. "I didn't want to come here. I had no choice. Please tell me this gets easier." Mrs. Callan stepped aside, gesturing her in with a brisk wave. "He's in his study. You'll meet him at dinner. Don't be late for that either." The door shut behind her with a finality that made Leora's stomach twist into knots. Inside, Thornridge was even colder than outside. The entry hall stretched long and narrow, the floors made of dark stone that seemed to swallow sound. The walls were bare except for old maps, coastlines and property lines drawn in fading ink, and portraits of men who all looked the same. Hard-jawed, unsmiling, eyes like flint. Thornridges, she assumed. Generations of them, staring down at her like they already knew she didn't belong. The air smelled of salt and smoke and something older, something that had seeped into the wood and stone over decades, centuries maybe. There were no flowers, no curtains softening the windows, no rugs to warm the floors, nothing that suggested anyone had ever lived here, only survived. Mrs. Callan led her up a narrow staircase, their footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The walls here were closer, the ceiling lower, and Lyora felt the weight of the house pressing down on her. At the top of the stairs, a long hallway stretched into shadow, doors lining both sides like teeth in a jaw. Your room is at the end of the hall, Mrs. Callan said, not slowing. You'll have an hour to settle. Dinner is at 7 sharp. Don't wander. Why not? Leora asked before she could stop herself. Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended, almost childlike. Mrs. Callan paused, glancing back over her shoulder. Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Pity, maybe, or warning. Because Mr. Thornridge doesn't like disruptions, she said quietly. And you, Mrs. Thornridge, are already one. The words hung in the air like smoke. Mrs. Callan turned and continued down the hall, leaving Leora standing there, cold and wet, and suddenly very aware of how alone she was. The room they gave her was small, clean, but sparse in a way that felt deliberate, like warmth had been scrubbed out along with the dust. A bed, narrow, neatly made with rough linens, a chair by the window, a washstand with a chipped basin, a single candle on the nightstand, already lit, its flame struggling against the draft, and a window, a large one, facing the cliffs and the endless churning sea. Leora set down her single bag. Everything she owned in the world fit into one worn leather case, and stood in the center of the room, her arms wrapped around herself, trying to stop shaking. She wasn't shaking from the cold. She'd known what this was. Her family had made it abundantly clear. Elias Thornridge needed a wife to satisfy the expectations of the neighboring estates, to keep up appearances while he waited for the woman he actually wanted, someone from a powerful family, someone with connections and money and a name that mattered. Leora was a placeholder, a stand-in, a warm body to fill a role until the real wife came along. She'd agreed because she had no other options. Her father's debts had seen to that. 3 years of gambling and bad investments had left them with nothing. The estate sold, the staff dismissed, the furniture auctioned off piece by piece. When Elias's offer came, a marriage in exchange for clearing the debts, her father had signed the papers before she'd even finished reading them. You should be grateful, he'd told her, not meeting her eyes. A girl with no dowry, no prospects. You're lucky he's willing. Lucky. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her palms to her knees, forcing herself to breathe. You can do this. You've survived worse. Except she wasn't sure that was true. Outside, the sea roared against the cliffs, a constant, violent rhythm that seemed to shake the very bones of the house. Leora stood and moved to the window, pressing her forehead against the cold glass. Below, waves crashed against jagged rocks, throwing up plumes of white spray that the wind tore apart before they could settle. The cliffs dropped straight down, a sheer fall to the water, and for a moment she understood why they called this place Thornridge. Sharp, unforgiving, built to withstand. She wondered if she was. Dinner was worse than she'd imagined. The dining hall was cavernous, the kind of room designed for gatherings that never happened. The ceiling arched high overhead, disappearing into shadow. The table was long enough to seat 20, though only 2 places were set, one at the head, one several feet down, and to the side, like an afterthought. Candles flickered in the drafts, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own, and a fire burned in the massive hearth at the far end of the room, but it didn't seem to produce any warmth, just light, just noise. Leora sat where Mrs. Callan had indicated, her hands folded in her lap, her spine straight, her eyes down. She'd changed into a clean dress, her best one, though it was plain and a season out of fashion, and tried to do something with her hair, but the mirror in her room was so tarnished she could barely see herself. She felt like a child playing dress-up, pretending to be someone important. And then he walked in. Elias Thornridge. He was taller than she remembered, broader. His dark hair was slightly damp, like he'd just come in from the rain, and his shirt sleeves were rolled to his elbows, revealing forearms marked with old scars. Thin white lines that looked like they'd come from work, not war. He moved with the kind of precision that came from a life lived in discipline, every step deliberate, every gesture controlled. His face was all sharp angles, his jaw tight, his eyes a cold, distant gray that reminded her of the sea on a sunless day. He didn't look at her. He sat at the head of the table, poured himself a glass of wine from the decanter already waiting, and began eating without a word. No greeting, no acknowledgement, nothing. Leora stared at her plate. Her throat felt like sandpaper. A servant, silent, efficient, placed food in front of her. Roasted meat, potatoes, bread. It smelled good, but she couldn't imagine eating. The silence stretched. The only sounds were the clink of silverware against porcelain, the crackle of the fire, the wind battering the windows like it wanted in. She counted her breaths. 1, 2, 3. She wanted to say something, anything, but every word she thought of felt wrong, too small, too stupid. Finally, she couldn't stand it anymore. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely carrying across the space between them. For allowing me to come here." Elias's hand paused mid-reach for his glass. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she thought he might say something kind, something welcoming. "You're here because it was arranged," he said. His voice was low, flat, with the kind of careful neutrality people used when they were holding something back. Not cruel, but not kind either. Just empty. "Not because I allowed it." Leora's cheeks burned. She looked down at her hands, her nails digging into her palms. "Right," she whispered. He went back to eating. She didn't try to speak again. The meal dragged on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes. Leora picked at her food, managing a few bites just so the servants wouldn't think she was ungrateful. Every sound seemed magnified. The scrape of her fork, the rustle of her dress when she shifted, her own breathing. She kept her eyes on her plate, but she could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her. The portraits on the walls, the empty chairs, the man at the head of the table who ate like she wasn't even there. When he finally stood, she flinched. "I'll be in my study," he said, addressing no one in particular. "Don't wait up." And he left. Leora sat there for a long moment, staring at the empty doorway, the half-eaten food on his plate, the wine glass he'd drained and left behind. Then she stood, her legs shaky, and walked back to her room alone. The days that followed blurred together into a numbing routine that felt less like living and more like existing. Elias barely acknowledged her. He rose early, before dawn, Mrs. Callan said, and spent his days managing the estate, overseeing the tenants who worked the land, inspecting the livestock, meeting with merchants from the nearby port town, reviewing accounts, settling disputes. He was everywhere and nowhere, always moving, always working, always in control. The estate ran like a well-oiled machine, and he was the engine that kept it turning. And Leora, she was invisible. Mrs. Callan gave her tasks, small, meaningless things designed to keep her occupied. Mending linens that didn't really need mending. Organizing the library, dusting books no one read, straightening shelves no one looked at. Sitting quietly in the drawing room in case visitors came. They never did. At meals, Elias was silent. If she asked a question, "How was your day? Is there anything I can help with?" he answered in as few words as possible. "Fine." "No." If she didn't speak, neither did he. The space between them grew wider every day, a chasm she couldn't cross no matter how hard she tried. The servants pitied her. She could see it in their eyes, the way they spoke to her gently, like she was fragile, like she might shatter if they spoke too loud. The way they avoided mentioning him unless absolutely necessary. The way they found small kindnesses to offer. An extra blanket when the nights turned cold, a cup of tea brought to her room without her asking, a soft word here and there. One of the younger maids, a girl named Bess with red hair and freckles, had even tried to comfort her once. It was a gray afternoon, and Leora had been in the laundry room, helping fold sheets because she didn't know what else to do with herself. Bess had been working beside her, humming softly under her breath, when she'd suddenly stopped and looked at Leora with something like sympathy. "He's always been like this, ma'am," Bess had said softly, her hands still moving, folding a pillowcase with practiced efficiency. "Cold, distant, even before you came. It's not you." Leora had tried to smile, but it felt like her face didn't remember how. "What is it then?" Bess had hesitated, glancing toward the door like she was afraid someone might hear. Then she'd leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "They say he's been waiting for someone else. Someone better." The word had hit like a slap. "Better," Leora had repeated, her voice hollow. Bess had winced, realizing what she'd said. "I didn't mean, I just meant someone from a better family. You know how these things work, ma'am. Marriages are business. Always have been." "Right," Leora had said. She'd folded the sheet in her hands, creasing it perfectly, and set it aside. "Business. But it felt like it was her. It felt like every cold glance, every silence, every moment he looked through her instead of at her was proof that she wasn't enough, wasn't interesting enough, wasn't beautiful enough, wasn't something enough. 3 months in, Leora overheard the conversation that changed everything. She'd been in the library, one of the few places she was allowed to go without question. It was a massive room, 2 stories tall with shelves that climbed the walls and a ladder on wheels to reach the higher books. Most of them were old, histories of the estate, ledgers, maps, legal documents. But there were a few novels tucked away in the corners, and Leora had taken to reading them in the afternoons when she had nothing else to do. She'd been curled up in a chair by the window, a book open in her lap that she wasn't really reading. The words kept sliding off the page, refusing to stick. Outside, the sky was the color of slate, and the sea churned restlessly. She could hear the wind moaning through the eaves, and somewhere in the house a door slammed. The library door was ajar. She hadn't bothered to close it, and voices drifted in from the hall, male voices. One she didn't recognize, harsh and impatient. The other was Elias, calm and measured as always. "Ridiculous to keep dragging this out," the unfamiliar voice said. "You've had her here for months. What's the point?" "The point," Elias said, his tone edged with something that might have been irritation, "is that appearances matter. You know that as well as I do." "Appearances?" The man snorted. "You mean lies. Call it what you want." There was a pause, the sound of footsteps pacing. Leora's hand stilled on the book in her lap, her heart beginning to pound. "Send her back," the man said. "The Veil girl is nobody. You've done your duty. You've played the game. Now make the real match." Leora's breath caught. "I'll handle it," Elias said. "When?" "Soon." "Soon isn't good enough, Thornridge. The Ashford family won't wait forever. If you want their daughter, you need to act. That means getting rid of the placeholder." Placeholder. The word echoed in her head, louder than the wind, louder than the sea, louder than her own heartbeat. "I'm aware," Elias said, and his voice was so cold it could have frozen the air. "Then do it. Send her away. Pay her off. Whatever it takes. Just get it done." "I said I'll handle it." "You're too soft, Thornridge. That's always been your problem. You let things linger when you should cut them clean." There was a long silence. Leora pressed her back against the chair, her hands gripping the book so hard her knuckles ached. "She's not a thing," Elias said quietly. "Isn't she?" The man laughed, sharp and humorless. "You bought her, didn't you? Paid off her father's debts, took her off his hands. That sounds like a transaction to me." Another silence, longer this time. "Get out," Elias said, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm trying to help you. I don't need your help. Get out." Footsteps, the heavy sound of boots on stone, then the front door opening and slamming shut, the sound reverberating through the house. Leora sat there, frozen, the book slipping from her hands and hitting the floor with a soft thud. Placeholder, send her back, get rid of her. She'd known. Of course she'd known. But hearing it, hearing the words spoken out loud, hearing Elias agree to it so easily, so coldly, broke something inside her, something that had been holding on, hoping that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. She stood on shaking legs, left the book where it had fallen, and walked back to her room. That night, Leora didn't go to dinner. Mrs. Callan came to her room, knocking softly on the door. "Mrs. Thornridge, you're expected downstairs." Leora was sitting on the bed, still fully dressed, staring at the wall. "I'm not feeling well," she said. Her voice sounded strange even to her own ears. Hollow, distant. "Shall I send for—" "No, I just need to rest." There was a long pause. Then Mrs. Callan said carefully, "He'll notice if you don't come." "Will he?" Leora asked, and she almost laughed. Almost. Another pause. "I'll tell him you're indisposed." "Thank you." Mrs. Callan's footsteps faded down the hall. Leora lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the candle on the nightstand, and outside the wind howled. She thought about leaving, about packing her bag, that single pathetic bag, and walking out into the night. But where would she go? Back to her father, who'd sold her off to settle his debts and wouldn't take her back even if she begged? To the streets of the nearest town, where she had no money, No connections, no skills that would keep her alive? No. She was trapped. But something inside her shifted that night. A quiet, stubborn thing that had been curled up tight in her chest for years. Something that had survived her mother's death, her father's indifference, the slow crumbling of her family's fortune. Something that refused to break. If she was temporary, fine. But she wouldn't disappear quietly. She wouldn't fade into the walls of this house like a ghost. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of pretending she didn't matter. She would make him see her, even if it was only so he'd remember her when she was gone. Over the next few weeks, Leora stopped trying. She stopped reaching for Elias's attention, stopped asking questions at dinner, stopped dressing carefully, stopped choosing her words with care, stopped hoping that today might be the day he looked at her like she was real. She moved through the house like a shadow, doing what was expected and nothing more. She didn't smile at him when he passed her in the hall, didn't linger in doorways hoping he'd speak, didn't set the table with flowers from the garden or choose her seat at dinner based on where she thought he might like her to sit. She just existed. And strangely, that's when he started to notice. It was small at first, a glance that lasted a second too long, a pause when she entered a room, like he was trying to remember something. Once, at dinner, he'd actually looked at her, really looked, and frowned. "Are you unwell?" he'd asked. Leora had looked up from her plate, surprised he'd spoken. "No." "You've been quiet." She'd almost laughed at that. "I'm always quiet." He'd frowned again, deeper this time, like that answer didn't sit right. "You used to ask questions." "Did I?" She'd gone back to her food. "I don't remember." He'd watched her for another moment, then returned to his own meal, but the frown hadn't left his face. Leora had felt something then. Not satisfaction, exactly. Not even pleasure. Just a small, sharp awareness that for the first time since she'd arrived, she'd said something that had actually landed. She'd made him feel something, even if it was just confusion. The days grew colder. Autumn settled over Thornridge like a heavy cloak, bringing with it rain that never seemed to stop and winds that rattled the windows at night. The servants began preparing for winter, stocking the pantries, checking the firewood, making sure the chimneys were clear. Mrs. Callan moved through the house with grim efficiency, barking orders, and the maids scurried to keep up. Leora helped where she could. She didn't have to. No one expected it, but it gave her something to do, and the work kept her hands busy and her mind quiet. She peeled potatoes in the kitchen. She helped Bess scrub floors. She sorted through old linens, separating what could be mended from what needed to be burned. The servants stopped pitying her, or maybe they just got used to her. Either way, they started talking around her like she was one of them. Gossip about the tenants, complaints about the weather, speculation about whether the master would go to the port town for the winter market. "He always does," Bess said one afternoon, elbow deep in soapy water. "Every year. Buys up half the stock before anyone else gets a chance." "Does he take anyone with him?" Leora asked, more out of curiosity than anything else. "No, ma'am. Always goes alone." Bess glanced at her. "You could ask to go, though. Might be nice to get out of the house." Leora shook her head. "He wouldn't want that." "You don't know that." "I do." Bess had looked like she wanted to argue, but she'd just sighed and gone back to scrubbing. The breaking point came on a gray afternoon in late autumn when the rain had finally stopped but the sky stayed dark and heavy, threatening more. Leora had been in the garden, if you could call it that, a small patch of earth behind the house where a few stubborn plants clung to life, despite the wind and salt and general hostility of the environment. Someone had tried to grow herbs there once, maybe, but most of them were dead now. A few rosemary bushes survived, along with some scraggly thyme and a single lavender plant that looked like it was holding on out of spite. Leora liked it there. It was quiet. No one bothered her, and there was something satisfying about pulling weeds, about clearing away the dead growth, and giving the living plants a little more room to breathe. She was kneeling in the dirt, her skirts tucked up, her hands already filthy, when she heard voices. Elias and another man. She couldn't see them, but they were close. Just around the corner of the house, near the stone wall that separated the garden from the courtyard. "You're making a mistake," the man said. His voice was older, rougher, not the same man from before. The veil arrangement was always meant to be short-term. You've kept her longer than necessary. I'm aware, Elias said, and even through the wall, Leora could hear the tension in his voice. Then why haven't you ended it? There was a long pause. Leora's hand stilled in the dirt. Her breath caught in her throat. I will, Elias said finally. When the time is right. The time is right. The Ashford girl is waiting. Her father's getting impatient. If you delay much longer, you'll lose the opportunity. I said I'll handle it. The man sighed, exasperated. You're too soft, Thornridge. That's always been your problem. You let things linger when you should cut them clean. Sentiment has no place in business. This isn't... Elias stopped. Started again. I'm not being sentimental. Aren't you? Then what's stopping you? Silence. Leora pressed her palms flat against the dirt, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She's not a thing, Elias said quietly. Isn't she? The man's voice was cold, dismissive. You made a deal. Her father got his debts cleared. You got a wife to keep up appearances. That's all she is. A piece of the arrangement, and now the arrangement is done. Another long silence, then footsteps. They were leaving. Leora sat back on her heels, staring at the rosemary bush in front of her. Its leaves were dark green, almost black in the gray light, and they smelled sharp and clean when she touched them. She's not a thing. But he hadn't defended her beyond that. Hadn't said she mattered. Hadn't said he'd keep her. Hadn't said anything that suggested she was more than an inconvenience he'd eventually deal with. She looked down at her hands, dirt under her nails, her palms red and raw from the cold and the work. Her wedding ring caught the light, a thin gold band that had never felt like it belonged on her finger, and she made a decision. That night, Leora began to plan. Not a dramatic escape, not a confrontation. She wasn't brave enough for that, and she wasn't stupid enough to think it would change anything. Just leaving. She had a little money. Not much, just the small allowance Mrs. Callan gave her each month for personal expenses. Leora had never spent it. What was there to buy? She had no friends to visit, no shops to browse, nowhere to go. So she'd saved it, tucking the coins away in a small purse she kept hidden in the bottom of her drawer. She counted it that night, spreading the coins out on her bed. 43 silver marks and a handful of coppers. Enough to get her to the port town, maybe. Enough for a week's lodging if she was careful. Enough for a fresh start if she was lucky. She started packing in secret. Just a few things. She didn't have much to begin with. A change of clothes, a nightgown, the small locket her mother had given her before she died, with a faded portrait of her parents inside. A book she'd borrowed from the library and never returned. She packed slowly, over the course of several days, so no one would notice. She folded each item carefully, methodically, like she was performing a ritual. And maybe she was. A ritual of letting go. She didn't know where she'd go. Maybe to the coast, to one of the fishing villages where women worked the nets and the docks, and no one asked questions. Maybe inland, to one of the farming towns where she could find work as a maid or a cook. Maybe nowhere. Maybe she'd just keep walking until she found a place that felt less cold. Didn't matter. What mattered was that she wouldn't be here when Elias finally decided to handle it. But she wouldn't wait around to be discarded like old furniture, sent back to a father who wouldn't want her, dismissed with a payoff and a pat on the head. She wouldn't give him that power. She'd leave first. She'd choose herself for once in her life. And if it killed her, if she ended up starving in some gutter or worse, at least it would be her choice. At least she'd have that. The decision to leave didn't make Leora feel brave. It made her feel sick. She kept the bag hidden under her bed, packed and ready, and every time she looked at it, her stomach twisted into knots. She told herself she was doing the right thing, that staying would only make it worse, that waiting around to be dismissed was its own kind of death. But knowing something and feeling it were different things entirely. The days stretched on, each one colder than the last. November settled over Thornridge with a vengeance, bringing frost that turned the grass brittle and mornings so cold the water in the wash basin had a thin skin of ice. Leora wrapped herself in shawls and kept moving, because standing still meant thinking, and thinking meant doubting, and doubt was a luxury she couldn't afford. She watched Elias more carefully now, not because she wanted to, but because she needed to know when he'd make his move, when he'd finally call her into his study and tell her the arrangement was over, when he'd hand her a purse of coins and a letter of passage and send her on her way like she'd never been there at all. But he didn't. Instead, he started watching her back. It was subtle at first, a lingering glance across the dinner table, a pause in the hallway when their paths crossed. Once she'd been in the library, her usual spot by the window, and she'd felt eyes on her. She'd looked up to find him standing in the doorway, just looking. Not angry, not cold, just looking, like he was trying to solve a puzzle he hadn't realized existed. "Do you need something?" she'd asked, her voice steady, even though her heart was racing. "No," he'd said after a long moment. Then he'd turned and walked away. It happened again 2 days later. She'd been helping Bess in the kitchen, peeling apples for preserves, when she'd glanced up and seen him through the window, standing in the courtyard. He'd been facing the house, his hands shoved in his pockets, his expression unreadable. When their eyes met, he'd looked away first. Leora didn't know what to make of it. "He's been strange lately," Bess said one afternoon, her voice low. They were alone in the laundry room, folding linens, and Bess kept glancing toward the door like she was afraid someone might hear. Distracted. "Mrs. Callan says he's been forgetting meetings, missing meals. That's not like him." "Maybe he's ill," Leora said, though she didn't believe it. "Maybe." Bess folded a sheet with practiced efficiency, her hands moving almost without thought. "Or maybe he's thinking about something. Someone." Leora's hand stilled. "What do you mean?" Bess hesitated, then leaned in closer. "There's talk, ma'am. In the village. They say the Ashford family's getting impatient. They say if Mr. Thornridge doesn't act soon, they'll withdraw the offer." "Good," Leora said, the word slipping out before she could stop it. Bess blinked, surprised. "You don't mean that." "Don't I?" Leora folded the pillowcase in her hands with sharp, deliberate movements. "Let them withdraw. Let him marry whoever he wants. I don't care." "Ma'am, I don't," Leora said, more forcefully this time. "I never did." It was a lie, but it felt good to say it. It felt like armor. Bess opened her mouth, then closed it again. She went back to folding, but Leora could feel her eyes, worried and uncertain. That night at dinner, Elias broke the silence. "You've been spending time in the kitchen," he said. Leora looked up, startled. They were halfway through the meal, and he hadn't spoken a word until now. "Yes." "Why?" She set down her fork. "Because I have nothing else to do." "There are other things." "Like what?" The words came out sharper than she'd intended, but she didn't take them back. "Sitting in the drawing room waiting for visitors who never come? Reading books in a library no one uses? Pretending I have a purpose here when we both know I don't?" His jaw tightened. "You're my wife." "Am I?" She laughed, short and bitter. "I'm a name on a piece of paper. That's all I've ever been. That's not—" "Then what am I, Elias?" She was standing now, though she didn't remember deciding to stand. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. "Tell me. Because I've been here for months, and I still don't know. I don't know what you want from me. I don't know what I'm supposed to be. All I know is that I'm temporary, and you're just waiting for the right moment to get rid of me." The silence that followed was deafening. Elias stared at her, his face pale, his knuckles white where they gripped the edge of the table. For a moment she thought he might actually answer, might actually say something real. Instead he stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "You're right," he said quietly. "You don't know." And he walked out. Leora stood there, her chest heaving, her hands still shaking. The candles flickered in the draft, and somewhere in the house a door slammed. She sat back down, picked up her fork, and tried to eat. She couldn't. The confrontation changed something. Leora wasn't sure what exactly, but the air in the house felt different, heavier, like a storm building just out of sight. Elias stopped coming to dinner. Mrs. Callan made excuses. He was busy with the estate, he had meetings in town, he preferred to eat in his study. But Leora knew better. He was avoiding her. And she didn't blame him. She'd crossed a line and there was no going back. But strangely, she didn't regret it. For the first time since she'd arrived at Thornridge, she'd said what she actually felt. She'd stopped pretending. And even though it had made everything worse, It had also made her feel more real, more solid, less like a ghost haunting someone else's life. She started eating in the kitchen with the servants, not because she had to, but because it was warmer there, both literally and figuratively. They didn't treat her like a lady. They treated her like one of them, teasing her when she burned the bread, laughing when she spilled flour on her dress, teaching her how to knead dough and pluck chickens, and do all the things a girl from a crumbling estate should have learned but never had. "You're good at this," Bess said one afternoon, watching Leora chop vegetables with surprising competence. "Better than most." "I used to help our cook," Leora said, "before we had to let her go." "You miss it?" Leora paused, the knife hovering over a carrot. "I miss having something to do, something that matters." "You matter here." "Do I?" Leora smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm a placeholder, Bess. Everyone knows it. That's not—" "It's fine," Leora said, going back to chopping. "I've made my peace with it." She hadn't, but saying it out loud made it easier to pretend. Bamkin. The letter came on a Tuesday. Mrs. Callan brought it to Leora's room, her face carefully neutral. "This arrived for you." Leora looked up from the book she wasn't reading. "For me?" "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Callan held out the envelope. It was thick, expensive paper sealed with wax. "It came by courier this morning." Leora took it, her hand suddenly cold. The wax seal bore a crest she didn't recognize, a hawk with its wings spread, talons extended. She broke the seal and unfolded the letter. The handwriting was precise, almost mechanical. "Mrs. Thornridge, it has come to my attention that your current arrangement may soon be dissolved. I write to offer an alternative. My household is in need of a governess for my daughters, and I believe you would be well suited to the position. The salary is modest but fair, and room and board are provided. Should you be interested, I can arrange transportation within the week. Sincerely, Lord Ashford." Leora read it twice, then a third time. Lord Ashford, the father of the woman Elias was supposed to marry, the man who was waiting for Leora to be discarded so the real wedding could happen. And he was offering her a job. It was a kindness, maybe, or an insult, or both. A way to make the transition clean, move her out, move his daughter in. Everyone gets what they want. Except Leora didn't want to be a governess. Didn't want to spend the rest of her life teaching someone else's children, living in someone else's house, always on the outside looking in. But what choice did she have? She folded the letter and set it on the nightstand. "Thank you, Mrs. Callan. Will you be responding?" "I don't know yet." Mrs. Callan nodded, her expression unreadable, and left. Leora sat there for a long time, staring at the letter. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. The sky was getting darker earlier now, the days shrinking as winter closed in. She thought about the bag under her bed, the coin she'd saved, the plan she'd made, and she thought about staying, not because she wanted to, not because she thought things would get better, but because leaving felt too much like losing. That night she went to dinner. She hadn't planned to. But when the clock struck 7, she found herself standing, smoothing her dress, walking down the stairs to the dining hall. The table was set for one, just her place, the other end empty and abandoned. She sat down and waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. She was about to give up when she heard footsteps. Elias appeared in the doorway, stopping short when he saw her. He looked exhausted, his shirt wrinkled, his hair disheveled, shadows under his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. "I didn't think you'd come," he said. "Neither did I." He hesitated, then moved to his usual seat at the head of the table. A servant appeared, silent, efficient, and began serving food. Neither of them spoke until the servant left. "I got a letter today," Leora said, breaking the silence. "From Lord Ashford." Elias's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "What did it say?" "He offered me a position, as a governess for his daughters." Elias set down his fork, his jaw tight. "And?" "And I'm considering it." "You want to be a governess?" "No," Leora said honestly, "but I don't want to be here either." The words hung between them like smoke. Elias leaned back in his chair, his hands flat on the table. "If this is about what I said—" "It's not about one thing," Leora interrupted. "It's about everything. It's about the fact that I've been here for months, and I still don't know why. It's about being treated like I'm invisible one day and scrutinized the next. It's about knowing I'm temporary and waiting for the axe to fall. You're not. Don't lie to me. Her voice was quiet but firm. I heard you. I heard the conversations. I know what this is, and I'm tired of pretending I don't. Elias stared at her, something flickering in his eyes that she couldn't quite name. Anger, maybe. Or guilt. You weren't supposed to hear that, he said finally. But I did. And now you want to leave. I want to have a choice, Leora said. For once in my life, I want to choose something for myself. So choose, she blinked. What? Choose. He stood, his chair scraping against the floor. Stay or go. It's up to you. That's not... She shook her head, frustration bubbling up. You don't get to do that. You don't get to put this on me. Why not? You just said you wanted a choice. I'm giving you one. You're giving me an impossible choice, she shot back. Stay in a house where I'm not wanted, or leave with nothing and nowhere to go. You'd have the position with Ashford. I don't want the position with Ashford. She was on her feet now, her hands clenched into fists. I don't want to be a governess. I don't want to live the rest of my life in someone else's shadow. Always the person who wasn't good enough, who wasn't chosen. Then what do you want? Elias's voice rose to match hers, his control finally cracking. Tell me, Leora, what do you actually want? I want matter. The words burst out of her, raw and honest and terrifying. I want to be seen. I want to be more than a placeholder, or a name on a piece of paper, or a problem you have to solve. I want... She stopped, her throat closing around the rest of the sentence. Elias stared at her, his chest heaving, his eyes wide. You want what? He said quietly. Leora swallowed hard. I want to be enough. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then Elias crossed the room in 3 long strides and stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his gray eyes, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off him. You are enough, he said, his voice low and rough. You've always been enough. That was never the problem. Then what is? He didn't answer. Instead, he reached up, his hand hovering near her face like he wanted to touch her but didn't know if he should. I don't know how to do this, he said finally. I don't know how to be... this. Be what? Married. To you. To anyone. He dropped his hand, frustration etched into every line of his face. I thought it would be easy. I thought I could keep it simple, keep it distant, keep it from mattering, but you... He stopped, shaking his head. You make it matter. Leora's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Elias, don't accept Ashford's offer, he said abruptly. Don't go. Why not? Because I'm asking you not to. That's not a reason. It's the only one I have right now. She stared at him, searching his face for something, truth maybe, or certainty, or anything that would make this make sense. But all she saw was a man who looked as lost as she felt. I need more than that, she said softly. I know. He stepped back, running a hand through his hair. I know, I need time. How much time? I don't know. Leora closed her eyes, exhaustion washing over her. I can't do this anymore, Elias. I can't keep waiting for you to decide if I'm worth keeping. You are. Then prove it. She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze head on. Stop hiding. Stop avoiding me. Stop treating me like I'm something you'll deal with later. Either I'm your wife or I'm not. Either I belong here or I don't. But I can't live in this limbo anymore. Elias looked like she'd struck him. He opened his mouth, closed it, then turned away. I'll think about it, he said, and he left. Leora stood there in the empty dining hall, her hands shaking, her eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall. She'd given him an ultimatum, she'd drawn a line, and now she had to live with whatever came next. But the next morning, Leora woke to find a note slipped under her door. It was short, written in Elias's precise handwriting. I'm going to the port town for the winter market. I'll be back in 3 days. We'll talk then. That was it. No explanation, no promise. Just, we'll talk. Leora crumpled the note and threw it in the fire. 3 days. She had 3 days to decide what to do. She could wait. She could give him the time he'd asked for, hope that when he came back, he'd actually have something real to say. Or she could leave. The bag was still under her bed. The coins were still in her drawer. Ashford's letter was still on the nightstand. All she had to do was choose. She lasted 2 days. On the morning of the 3rd day, Leora woke before dawn, dressed in her warmest clothes, and pulled the bag out from under the bed. Her hands were steady as she counted the coins one last time, as she folded Ashford's letter and tucked it into her pocket, as she put on her cloak and laced up her boots. She didn't write a note. What would she say? Thank you for nothing? I hope you find what you're looking for? No. Let him come back to an empty room. Let him wonder. Let him feel just for a moment what it was like to be left behind. She made it as far as the front door before Mrs. Callan found her. Mrs. Thornridge? The older woman's voice was careful, neutral. Where are you going? Away, Leora said. Does he know? No. Mrs. Callan studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she sighed. You'll need warmer clothes than that, and more money. Wait here. She disappeared before Leora could argue, returning 5 minutes later with a heavy wool coat, a scarf, and a small purse. Take these, she said, pressing them into Leora's hands. The coat was mine when I was younger. The money is from the household fund. Consider it severance. Leora stared at her, throat tight. Why are you helping me? Because I've been where you are, Mrs. Callan said quietly, and no one helped me. She reached out, briefly touching Leora's shoulder. Be safe, child, and don't look back. Leora nodded, unable to speak. She pulled on the coat, wrapped the scarf around her neck, and stepped out into the cold. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of gray and pale gold. The wind cut through her like a knife, but she kept walking. Down the long drive, past the gates, onto the road that led away from Thornridge. She didn't look back. Not even once. But 3 miles down the road, with the estate long out of sight and her legs starting to ache, she heard hoofbeats. She turned, her heart sinking. A rider was coming fast, the horse's breath steaming in the cold air. Elias. He pulled up short when he reached her, the horse dancing sideways. He was breathing hard, his face pale, his eyes wild. What are you doing? He demanded. Leaving, Leora said. Like I said I would. You didn't say. I said I couldn't live in limbo. You left. So I'm leaving too. I was coming back. Were you? She laughed, sharp and bitter. Or were you just buying more time to avoid making a decision? Elias swung down from the horse, landing hard. You can't just walk away. Watch me. Leora, no. She held up a hand, stopping him. You had your chance. You had months, and you gave me nothing, not honesty, not clarity, not even the courtesy of a real goodbye. So I'm done waiting. Where will you go? I don't know. Somewhere. Anywhere. She adjusted the bag on her shoulder. It doesn't matter. It'll be better than staying somewhere I'm not wanted. You are wanted. The words came out strangled, desperate. By who? Leora demanded. You? Because you've done a hell of a job showing it. Elias flinched. I know I've been... He stopped, struggling. I don't know how to do this. So you've said. I mean it. He took a step closer. No one's ever... He shook his head, frustrated. I'm not good at this. At feeling things. At letting people in. And you just walked into my life and turned everything upside down. And I didn't know how to handle it. So you handled it by ignoring me. Yes. The admission came out quiet, ashamed. I thought if I kept my distance, it wouldn't matter. I thought I could keep it from mattering, but it does. You do. Leora's chest ached. That's not enough, Elias. I know. He reached for her, his hand catching hers. I know it's not, but I'm asking you, please. Don't go, not like this. Give me a chance to do better. Why should I? Because He stopped. The words caught in his throat. Because I need you. It wasn't I love you. It wasn't a grand declaration, but it was real, raw, honest, and it broke something open in Leora's chest. She looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face. "If I stay," she said slowly, "things have to change." "They will. I mean it, Elias. I won't be invisible anymore. I won't be temporary. I won't be something you deal with when it's convenient." "You won't be." He squeezed her hand. "I swear. And if you break that promise, I won't." Leora studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any hint of doubt, any sign that this was just another empty promise. But all she saw was fear. Fear that she'd walk away, fear that he'd already lost her, fear that matched her own. She took a shaky breath. "One chance," she said. "That's all you get." Relief flooded his face. "That's all I need." He pulled her into his arms, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Thornridge, Leora felt something other than cold. She felt seen. She felt seen. But feeling seen and being safe were two different things entirely. The ride back to Thornridge was quiet. Leora sat in front of Elias on the horse, his arms around her holding the reins, and neither of them spoke. The wind had picked up, carrying the smell of snow, and the sky had turned the color of old iron. Her bag was tied to the saddle, bouncing against her leg with every stride, a reminder of how close she'd come to leaving, how close she still was. Because one promise on a cold road didn't erase months of silence, didn't undo the conversation she'd overheard, the plans she knew he'd made, didn't change the fact that somewhere in the world there was a woman waiting to take her place. When they reached the estate, Elias dismounted first, then reached up to help her down. His hands lingered on her waist, his eyes searching hers like he was afraid she might bolt. "I meant what I said," he told her quietly. "I know." She stepped back, breaking the contact. "But meaning it and doing it are different things." His jaw tightened, but he nodded. "I'll prove it to you." "You'd better." She walked into the house without looking back, leaving him standing in the courtyard with the horse. Mrs. Callan was waiting in the entry hall, her face carefully neutral. If she was surprised to see Leora return, she didn't show it. "Welcome back, ma'am," she said simply. "Thank you." Leora pulled off the borrowed coat, handing it back. "For everything." Mrs. Callan took it, her eyes flicking briefly to the doorway where Elias was now visible, unsaddling the horse. "Will you be staying then? For now? And later?" Leora met her gaze. "That depends on him." Mrs. Callan nodded slowly. "Then I hope he's smarter than he's been." "So do I." The change didn't come all at once. It came in pieces, small and tentative, like someone learning to walk after a long illness. Elias started showing up to dinner again. Not every night. He still had work, still had responsibilities, but more often than not. And when he came, he talked. Real conversation, not just clipped responses or strained silence. He asked about her day, told her about the tenants, the repairs needed on the north wall, the merchant who'd tried to overcharge him for lumber. It felt strange at first, performative almost, like he was following a script he'd memorized. But gradually it started to feel more natural, less like an obligation and more like something he actually wanted to do. One evening, he brought her a book. "I found this in the study," he said, setting it on the table beside her plate. "I thought you might like it." Leora picked it up. It was old, the leather cover worn smooth, the pages yellowed, a collection of poems. "Thank you." "You don't have to thank me." "I know, but I am." He sat down across from her, pouring wine into both their glasses. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about what you said, about wanting to matter." Leora set the book down, her pulse quickening. And you're right. I've treated you like you're temporary, like you're just here until something better comes along, and that's—" He stopped, struggling with the words. "That's not fair to either of us." "No?" Leora agreed quietly. "It's not. I want to fix it. I just don't know how." "Start by being honest," she said, "about what you want, about what this is." Elias looked down at his glass, turning it slowly between his hands. "I don't know what this is," he admitted. "I thought I did. I thought it was simple, a business arrangement, nothing more. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being simple." "When?" He laughed, short and humorless. "I don't even know." Maybe when you stopped trying to please me. Maybe when you started working in the kitchen with the servants like you belonged there more than you belonged at my table. Maybe, he looked up at her, something raw in his eyes. Maybe when I realized I'd started looking for you. In rooms, in hallways, listening for your voice. Leora's throat tightened. Elias, I'm not good at this, he said again. But I'm trying. I need you to know that. I do. She reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. I see you trying. He turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers. Stay, he said quietly. Not because you have nowhere else to go. Not because of some promise I made on a road. Stay because you want to. I don't know if I do yet, Leora said honestly, but I'm still here. That's enough. It wasn't, but it was a start. 2 weeks later, the letter arrived. Leora was in the garden, the small, stubborn patch of earth she'd been trying to coax back to life. When Bess came running out, her face flushed. Ma'am, you need to come inside. Leora stood, brushing dirt from her hands. What's wrong? There's a carriage from the Ashford estate. Bess's eyes were wide. Lord Ashford himself is here. Leora's stomach dropped. What does he want? I don't know, but Mr. Thornridge is with him in the study. And she hesitated. They're arguing. Leora didn't run. She walked. Slowly, deliberately. But her heart was racing by the time she reached the house. The study door was closed, but voices carried through the wood. Angry voices. Absolutely unacceptable, Thornridge. We had an agreement. We had a conversation. That's not the same thing. You gave me your word. I gave you nothing. That was Elias, his voice low and dangerous. I never signed anything. I never promised anything. And I'm not sending her away. You can't be serious. The girl is nobody. She has no family, no connections, nothing to offer you. My daughter, on the other hand, your daughter is welcome to find another husband. Silence. Then, quieter, almost disbelieving. You're choosing her? I'm choosing to keep what's mine. She was never meant to be yours. She was a placeholder, a convenience. You said so yourself. I was wrong. Leora's hand was on the door handle before she realized she'd moved. She pushed it open. Both men turned. Lord Ashford was exactly what she'd expected. Tall, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, with the kind of face that had probably never been told no in his entire life. Elias stood beside his desk, his hands clenched into fists, his face pale with barely controlled fury. Mrs. Thornridge, Ashford said, his tone cooling several degrees. How convenient. Perhaps you can talk sense into your husband. I doubt it, Leora said, stepping into the room. He's never listened to me before. Elias's eyes flicked to her, something that might have been amusement breaking through the anger. Ashford's jaw tightened. Then perhaps I'll speak plainly. Your presence here is causing problems. Problems that could be solved if you simply accepted my offer and moved on. Your offer to make me a governess, Leora said flatly. A generous offer. More than generous, considering your circumstances. My circumstances, Leora repeated. You mean the fact that my husband hasn't cast me aside yet? Your husband made a commitment. To me, Elias cut in, his voice like steel. I made a commitment to her. In front of witnesses, with legal documents. She's my wife. That's not negotiable. Everything is negotiable, Ashford said coldly. Annulments can be arranged. Settlements made. You know this. Get out. Excuse me? I said get out of my house. Elias moved around the desk, putting himself between Ashford and Leora. You came here uninvited, made demands you have no right to make, and insulted my wife under my own roof. So get out, before I have you thrown out. Ashford's face flushed red. You're making a mistake. Probably. But it's mine to make. For a moment, Ashford looked like he might argue. Then his gaze shifted to Leora, cold and assessing. You think you've won something, he said quietly. But you haven't. You're still nobody, still worthless. And when he realizes that, and he will, you'll have nothing. No family, no prospects, no future. Just the memory of thinking you mattered. The words hit like a physical blow, but Leora kept her face steady. Maybe, she said. But at least I'll have the memory. What will you have? Ashford's eyes narrowed. Then he turned on his heel and walked out, his footsteps echoing down the hall. The front door slammed hard enough to rattle the windows. Leora stood there, her hands shaking, her breath coming in short bursts. Are you all right? Elias asked quietly. No. She turned to look at him. What just happened? I chose you, he said simply. Why? Because I wanted to. That's going to cost you, Leora said. The Ashfords are powerful. They have connections. They could make things difficult for you. Let them try. Elias, I don't care. He crossed to her, taking her hands in his. I don't care about their connections or their money or their daughter. I care about this. About you. About us. And if that costs me, so be it. Leora stared at him, her eyes burning. You're an idiot. He smiled, faint and crooked. Probably. You just made an enemy of one of the most powerful families in the region. I know. And you're not afraid? Terrified, he admitted, but not of them, of losing you. That's worse. She kissed him. She didn't plan to, didn't think about it, just leaned up and pressed her mouth to his. He made a surprise sound, then pulled her closer, his hands framing her face, kissing her back like she was air and he'd been drowning. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. Stay, he whispered. Please, stay. I'm still here, she said. I'm not going anywhere. This time, she meant it. He met. But the trouble Ashford promised came faster than either of them expected. 3 days later, the first tenant left. Then another. Then 3 more. All of them apologetic, all of them claiming personal reasons, but Leora saw the truth in their faces. They'd been pressured, threatened maybe, or offered better terms somewhere else. Ashford was bleeding Thornridge dry. We can survive this, Elias said, though his voice was tight. They were in his study, going over the ledgers, and the numbers were grim. We have reserves. We'll tighten spending, make do with less. We've weathered worse. Have you? Leora asked. He didn't answer. The servant started whispering. Leora heard snatches of conversation when she passed, words like curse and mistake and not worth it. They didn't say it to her face, but she felt it, the weight of their judgment, the fear that she'd brought this on them. Maybe she had. One afternoon, she found Bess crying in the kitchen. What's wrong? Leora asked, kneeling beside her. My brother, Bess said, her voice thick. He works one of the tenant farms. Worked. He just got word that Lord Ashford's offered him a position. Better pay. Better land. But he has to leave by the end of the week. I'm sorry, Leora said quietly. It's not your fault. Isn't it? Bess looked at her red-eyed. You didn't ask for any of this. No, but I stayed anyway. Because you love him. Leora hesitated. Did she? She didn't know. She knew she cared. Knew she didn't want to leave. Knew that somewhere in the mess of the last few months, Elias had stopped being a stranger and started being something more. But love? I think so, she said finally. Maybe. I don't know yet. Then figure it out, Bess said, wiping her eyes. Because if you're going to stay, if you're going to let people lose their livelihoods over you, you'd better be sure. The words stung, but they were fair. That night, Leora couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind howl outside. The house felt different now, smaller, like the walls were closing in. She got up, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and went downstairs. Elias was in his study, hunched over the desk, a single candle burning low. He looked up when she entered, surprise flickering across his face. You should be sleeping, he said. So should you. He smiled faintly. Can't. Too much to do. Leora crossed to the desk, looking at the papers scattered across it. Ledgers. Letters, sirs. Maps. How bad is it? Bad, he admitted. We've lost nearly a third of our tenants. More are considering leaving, and Ashford's not done. He's been spreading rumors in town, saying we're unstable, saying I'm unfit to manage the estate. It's hurting our credit, our reputation, everything. Because of me. Because of him. Elias corrected. This isn't your fault, Leora. Then whose is it? You made a choice. I made a choice. And now people are suffering for it. People always suffer when power gets challenged, Elias said tiredly. That's how it works. Ashford wants to prove a point, that he can destroy anyone who defies him. But if I give in, if I send you away, it proves him right. It proves that he's stronger. And I'm not willing to do that. Even if it costs you everything? Even then. But Leora sank into the chair across from him. You're insane. Probably. He leaned back, rubbing his eyes. But I'm also right. If we give in now, we lose more than the estate. We lose ourselves. What if there's another way? Like what? Leora took a breath. What if I left? Not because he wants me to, but because I chose to. Just for a while. Just until things calm down. No. Elias, no. He leaned forward, his eyes fierce. That's exactly what he wants. He wants to separate us, break us, make you think you have to sacrifice yourself to save me. But you don't. We're stronger together. Are we? Because right now it feels like we're dragging each other down. Then we drown together. He reached across the desk, taking her hand. I'm not letting you go. Not for him. Not for anyone. Even if staying destroys you? Even then. Leora's chest ached. You're impossible. So are you. He pulled her to her feet around the desk into his arms. We're going to get through this. I promise. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that love, or whatever this was, could be enough. But deep down, she knew better. Love didn't stop storms. It didn't pay debts or feed tenants or rebuild reputations. And it definitely didn't defeat men like Lord Ashford. Well, the breaking point came 2 weeks later during the winter market. Elias had to go. It was expected, traditional, and backing out would only make things worse. Leora insisted on going with him. It's not safe, Elias argued. Ashford will be there. Half the region will be there. They're all talking. They're all watching. Good, Leora said. Let them watch. Leora, if I hide, it proves I'm ashamed, that I think I did something wrong. I won't do that. He tried to argue, but she was immovable. So they went together. The port town was packed. Stalls lined the streets, selling everything from livestock to cloth to spices. The smell of roasting meat and mulled wine filled the air, and everywhere Leora looked, there were people, laughing, bargaining, celebrating the season. But the moment she and Elias stepped out of the carriage, the laughter stopped. People stared, whispered, moved aside like they were contagious. Leora kept her chin up, her hand on Elias's arm, and forced herself to keep walking. They made it halfway through the market before someone stepped in front of them. Lord Ashford. Thornridge, he said pleasantly. What a surprise. Ashford. Elias's voice was flat. And Mrs. Thornridge. Still here, I see. How persistent. I prefer determined, Leora said coolly. Ashford smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Of course you do. He turned to Elias. I hope you're enjoying the market, though I imagine it's harder to enjoy when half your tenants are here shopping on someone else's coin. Is there a point to this conversation? Elias asked. Just making an observation. Ashford's smile widened. It's fascinating, really, how one poor decision can unravel so much, how pride can blind a man to what's best for him. Are we talking about me or you? Elias asked. The smile faltered. Careful, Thornridge. Or what? You'll take more tenants? Spread more lies? You've already done your worst. Have I? Ashford stepped closer, his voice dropping. You think losing a few tenants is my worst? You have no idea what I'm capable of. Then show me, Elias said, his voice low and dangerous. Do your worst. Burn it all down. I don't care. You're not getting what you want. Ashford's face darkened. You're a fool. Maybe, but I'm a free fool. Can you say the same? For a moment, Ashford looked like he might strike him. Then he laughed, sharp and cold. Enjoy the market, he said, while you still can. He walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Leora let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. That was stupid, Elias finished. I know, but I'm done bowing to him. He's going to retaliate. Let him. They continued through the market, but the damage was done. People avoided them. Merchants refused to meet their eyes. And when they finally made it back to the carriage, Leora felt like she'd run a gauntlet. That was a disaster, she said quietly. Probably. Do you regret it? Elias looked at her, his eyes serious. No. Do you? Leora thought about it. About the stares, the whispers, the weight of judgment and fear and pity, and about Elias standing beside her through all of it, refusing to back down, refusing to let her go. No, she said. I don't. He kissed her then, in front of anyone who cared to look. And Leora kissed him back, fierce and defiant. Let them watch. Let them judge. She was done being invisible. 3 days later, the fire started. It was past midnight when the bells rang. Leora woke to shouting, to the smell of smoke, to Elias shaking her shoulder. Get up, he said urgently. We have to go. What's happening? Fire, in the west wing. Move, now. She scrambled out of bed, grabbing her cloak. The hallway was chaos, servants running, smoke pouring up the stairs, the crackling roar of flames growing louder. Elias pulled her toward the main staircase, but halfway down, part of the ceiling collapsed, blocking the path. The back stairs, he said, redirecting. This way. They ran, Leora's lungs burning, her eyes stinging from the smoke. Behind them she could hear the fire spreading, consuming the house room by room. They made it outside just as the west wing's roof caved in, sending up a shower of sparks that lit the night like daylight. The staff was already there, forming a bucket line from the well, trying desperately to contain the blaze. But it was too late, too big, too fast. Leora stood there, watching Thornridge burn, and felt something inside her break. It was him, she said numbly. Ashford, he did this. You don't know that, Elias said, but his voice was hollow. Yes, I do. She turned to him, tears streaming down her face. He said he'd do his worst. And he did. Because of me. Because you chose me. Leora, this is my fault. It's not. Yes, it is. She was shouting now, her voice breaking. I should have left. I should have gone when I had the chance. Before this. Before people got hurt. Before. Elias grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. Listen to me. This is not your fault. You didn't start this fire. You didn't make Ashford into a monster. You didn't do anything wrong. Then why does it feel like I did? Because that's what he wants. He wants you to blame yourself, to think you're the problem. But you're not. You're the only good thing in this godforsaken place. Leora stared at him, her chest heaving, her world falling apart. And then she heard the screams. Someone was still inside. Someone was still inside. Leora heard it before she saw it, a voice, thin and desperate, cutting through the roar of flames, a child's voice. Mama, Mama, where are you? Her blood turned to ice. Who is that? Bess appeared beside her, her face streaked with soot and tears. It's Thomas, the stablemaster's boy. He must have run back in. He does that when he's scared, hides in the tack room. Leora was moving before she finished the sentence. Leora, no! Elias grabbed her arm, spinning her back. You can't go in there. There's a child. I know. I'll go. You don't know where the tack room is, Leora said, yanking her arm free. I do. I've been there every day for weeks. Then tell me. There's no time. The flames were spreading faster now, eating through the stable structure adjacent to the main house. Any moment, the whole thing could collapse. Let me go. Leora. She kissed him, hard and quick and desperate. Trust me. Then she ran. The heat hit her like a wall the moment she crossed the threshold. Smoke filled her lungs, thick and choking, and she pulled her cloak over her mouth, squinting through the haze. The tack room was at the back of the stable, past the stalls, past the feed storage, through a corridor that was already half engulfed. Thomas! She screamed. Thomas, where are you? Here. I'm here. She followed his voice, stumbling over debris, her eyes streaming. A beam crashed down to her left, sending up a shower of sparks. She ducked, kept moving. The tack room door was closed, but not locked. She threw it open. Thomas was huddled in the corner, maybe 7 years old, covered in ash, shaking so hard his teeth chattered. He looked up at her with huge, terrified eyes. "I want my mama," he whispered. "I know, sweetheart, I know." Leora crossed to him, scooping him up. He was heavier than she expected, solid muscle and bone, but adrenaline made her strong. "Hold on to me. Don't let go." He wrapped his arms around her neck, burying his face in her shoulder. The way back was worse. The fire had spread, blocking the path she'd taken. She had to improvise, cutting through a side corridor she barely remembered, praying it led outside and not deeper into the inferno. The ceiling groaned above her, timbers cracked. "Please," she whispered to no one, to everyone. "Please, just let us out." She saw daylight, a gap in the wall where the fire had eaten through, smoke pouring out like a signal. She ran for it, throwing herself and Thomas through just as the ceiling behind them collapsed with a sound like thunder. They hit the ground hard. Leora rolled, protecting Thomas with her body, and then hands were on her, pulling her up, pulling them both away from the flames. Elias. His face was white as bone. "Are you insane? Are you—" He stopped, looking at Thomas, then back at her. "You're insane." "Probably," Leora gasped, coughing so hard she thought her lungs might tear. Is he okay?" A woman pushed through the crowd, the stable master's wife, her face streaked with soot and tears. "Thomas! Oh, Thomas!" Thomas let go of Leora and launched himself at his mother, sobbing. The woman caught him, clutching him like she'd never let go, and looked at Leora over his head. "You saved him," she said, her voice breaking. "You saved my boy." Leora couldn't speak, could barely breathe. She just nodded. The woman pressed a hand to her mouth, tears streaming. "Thank you, thank you." Around them, the crowd had gone quiet. The servants, the tenants who'd stayed, even the ones who'd been whispering about curses and mistakes. They were all staring at Leora like they were seeing her for the first time. Elias wrapped an arm around her shoulders, holding her up when her legs started to shake. "You're done being reckless for tonight," he said, his voice rough. "Agreed," Leora managed. But as she looked at the faces around her, the shock giving way to something else, something that looked almost like respect, she realized something had shifted. She wasn't invisible anymore. Not to them. Not to anyone. They fought the fire until dawn. By the time the last embers were extinguished, half the west wing was gone, the stable was a blackened ruin, and everyone looked like they'd been through a war. Leora sat on the stone steps leading to the courtyard, wrapped in a blanket someone had given her, and watched the sun rise over the wreckage. Her hands were blistered, her lungs ached, her dress was ruined beyond repair. But Thomas was alive. Elias sank down beside her, equally filthy, equally exhausted. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "We need to talk about what you did," he said finally. "I know. That was the stupidest, most reckless— I know. You could have died. So could he." Elias scrubbed a hand over his face. "You're going to be the death of me." "Probably." She leaned against his shoulder. "But not today." He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "No, not today, Mrs. Callan approached, her face drawn with exhaustion, but her spine still straight. "Mr. Thornridge, Mrs. Thornridge, the staff is asking for direction." "What would you have us do?" Elias looked at the ruins, then at the people gathered in the courtyard, ash-covered, weary, but still standing. "Secure what's left, salvage what we can, set up temporary shelter in the barns for anyone who needs it, and send someone to town. We'll need supplies, lumber, tools. We don't have the funds from—" "Then we'll find them," Elias said flatly. "We're not giving up." Mrs. Callan nodded. "Yes, sir." She started to turn, then paused. "And Mrs. Thornridge, that was very brave, what you did." Leora blinked, surprised. Mrs. Callan wasn't the type to give compliments freely. "Thank you," she said quietly. Mrs. Callan allowed herself a small, tight smile. "Perhaps you're tougher than you look. Perhaps." When she was gone, Elias said, "She's right, you know." "About what?" "You're tougher than you look. Tougher than I gave you credit for." Leora laughed, tired and hollow. "I don't feel tough. I feel like I'm barely holding on. That's what tough is, Elias said, holding on when it would be easier to let go. She didn't have an answer for that, so she just sat there, leaning against him, watching the smoke curl into the morning sky. The investigators arrived 3 days later. They poked through the ruins, asked questions, took notes. Leora watched from a distance, her stomach in knots, knowing what they'd find even before they said it. Arson, the lead investigator announced, standing in what used to be the West Wing's drawing room. No question. Someone set this deliberately, started in multiple places at once. Whoever did it knew what they were doing. Can you prove who? Elias asked, his voice carefully controlled. Not yet, but we'll keep investigating. Except they wouldn't. Leora knew they wouldn't. Lord Ashford was too powerful, too well connected. Even if they found proof, even if they had witnesses, nothing would come of it. That was how the world worked. Power protected power. But she was done playing by those rules. That night, after Elias fell into an exhausted sleep in one of the guest rooms, the master bedroom was uninhabitable now, Leora slipped out of the house. She took one of the horses, riding carefully through the dark, following the coastal road toward town. The moon was full, casting silver light over the cliffs and the churning sea below. The wind was brutal, tearing at her cloak, but she kept going. She reached the Ashford estate just before midnight. It was massive, 3 times the size of Thornridge, all gleaming stone and manicured gardens and windows glowing with warm light. Guards stood at the gate, but Leora rode right up to them, pulling back her hood. "I need to see Lord Ashford," she said. The guards exchanged glances. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but tell him Leora Thornridge is here. He'll see me." One guard disappeared inside. The other watched her warily, hand on his weapon. Leora sat perfectly still on the horse, her heart pounding, her hand steady on the reins. The guard returned. "He'll see you, but you leave the horse here." Leora dismounted, letting them take the reins. They led her through the gates, up the sweeping drive, into the house. It was everything Thornridge wasn't. Warm, opulent, beautiful, paintings on every wall, rugs thick enough to sink into, chandeliers dripping with crystal. And servants everywhere, silent and efficient, moving like ghosts. Lord Ashford waited in his study, a room twice the size of Elias's, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a desk that looked like it cost more than most people made in a year. He stood when she entered, his expression carefully neutral. "Mrs. Thornridge, what an unexpected pleasure." "This isn't a social call," Leora said. "No, I didn't imagine it was." He gestured to a chair. "Please, sit." "I'd rather stand." "Suit yourself." He poured himself a drink, something amber in a crystal glass. "Can I offer you anything?" "Just honesty." Ashford smiled thinly. "I'm afraid that's in short supply these days." "Did you burn down Thornridge?" The smile didn't falter. "That's quite an accusation." "It's a question. And if I say yes? Then I want to know why. What did we do that was worth destroying people's lives? Worth risking a child's death?" Ashford's expression flickered, just for a moment, something that might have been surprise. "A child?" "The stablemaster's son. He was inside when the fire started. He almost died." For the first time since she'd met him, Ashford looked genuinely unsettled. He set down his glass. "I didn't know that." "Would it have mattered if you did?" He didn't answer. Leora stepped closer. "You wanted to punish Elias for choosing me. I understand that. You're powerful, and he defied you, and you wanted to make an example. But that fire, it didn't just hurt him. It hurt innocent people, people who had nothing to do with your wounded pride." "Careful," Ashford said, his voice cooling. "You're in my house, under my roof. I could have you removed." "Then do it," Leora said. "Throw me out. Add it to the list of cruelties. But before you do, answer me this. Was it worth it, breaking us? Destroying us? Did it make you feel powerful?" Ashford studied her for a long moment. "You're braver than I thought. I'm desperate. There's a difference. Is there?" He moved to the window, looking out over his perfect estate. "You want to know if it was worth it? The honest answer? I don't know. I wanted Thornridge to understand consequences, to learn that defying me comes at a cost. I never intended for anyone to be hurt. But they were. Yes." He turned back to her. "They were. and that's on me. Leora hadn't expected that, hadn't expected admission, even partial. So what now? She asked. You've made your point. You've proven you can destroy us. What more do you want? I want your husband to bow, Ashford said simply, to acknowledge that I was right, that marrying you was a mistake. He won't. Then you'll keep suffering. Leora took a breath. What if I left? Ashford's eyes sharpened. Explain. What if I left Thornridge, walked away, gave you what you wanted? Would that be enough? Would you leave Elias alone? Leora, she turned. Elias stood in the doorway, his face pale with fury. What the hell are you doing here? Negotiating, she said calmly. By offering to leave? He crossed the room in 3 strides. Have you lost your mind? No, I'm trying to save what's left of your estate. I don't want the estate without you. You say that now. I say that always. He grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. I don't care about the house. I don't care about the tenants, or the reputation, or any of it. I care about you. And if you think I'm going to let you sacrifice yourself to satisfy his ego, you're out of your mind. Elias, be reasonable. No. He turned to Ashford. You want me to bow? You want me to admit I was wrong? Fine. I was wrong. I was wrong to ever think you were worth appeasing. I was wrong to care what you thought. I was wrong to believe that power and money and connections mattered more than the person standing beside me. Is that what you wanted to hear? Ashford's face was unreadable. You're willing to lose everything. I've already lost half my house, Elias said flatly. What's the rest? Stone and wood. It can be rebuilt. But her? He looked at Leora. I can't rebuild that. I can't replace her, and I won't try. Leora's eyes burned. Elias, I love you, he said simply. I should have said it weeks ago, months ago. But I'm saying it now. I love you, and I'm not letting you go. Not for him, not for anyone. The room went silent. Ashford stared at them both, his expression cycling through surprise, irritation, and something that might have been grudging respect. You're both fools, he said finally. Probably, Elias agreed. But we're fools together. Ashford sighed, long and weary. He moved back to his desk, poured another drink, drained it in one swallow. I'll call off the pressure, he said quietly. I'll stop bleeding your tenants. I'll even provide materials for repairs. Consider it restitution. For the fire. Leora's breath caught. You're admitting? I'm admitting nothing, Ashford cut in sharply. But I'm also not a monster. A child almost died. That was never the intention. So I'm making it right. Take the offer or don't. But this is the only one you'll get. Elias looked at Leora. She looked back, searching his face. We'll take it, she said. Good. Ashford waved a hand. Now get out of my house. And Thornridge? Elias paused at the door. Don't make me regret this. I won't. The ride back to Thornridge was quiet. They rode together on Elias's horse. He'd followed her, apparently, the moment he realized she was gone. And the sun was just beginning to rise when the estate came into view. It looked different in the dawn light. Smaller, maybe. More broken. But also more real. You love me, Leora said, breaking the silence. I do. Since when? Elias was quiet for a moment. Since you stopped trying to be what I wanted and started being who you are. Since you stood up to me at dinner and told me I was being cruel. Since you walked into that burning building to save a child you barely knew. He tightened his arm around her waist. Maybe since the beginning. I don't know. But it's true. I love you too, Leora said, in case that wasn't clear. It wasn't, but I'm glad to hear it. She laughed, tired and relieved and overwhelmed all at once. When they reached the courtyard, the staff was already gathering. Word must have spread, somehow. It always did, because they were all staring at Elias and Leora with expressions that ranged from curious to hopeful. Mrs. Callan stepped forward. Sir, what happened? Ashford backed down, Elias said simply. He's providing materials for repairs. The pressure on the tenants stops. We rebuild. A murmur ran through the crowd. Disbelief. Relief. Something close to joy. And Mrs. Thornridge, Mrs. Callan asked, her eyes flicking to Leora. She stays? She stays, Elias said firmly. Not as a placeholder, not as a convenience, as my wife, my partner, the lady of this house. And anyone who has a problem with that can leave now. No one moved. Mrs. Callan allowed herself a rare smile. Then we'd best get to work. The crowd dispersed, already talking, already planning. And for the first time since the fire, Leora felt something other than fear or exhaustion. She felt hope. Rebuilding took months. The West Wing had to be completely reconstructed. The stable had to be torn down and started from scratch. And everywhere Leora looked, there was work to be done. But she threw herself into it. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She worked alongside the servants, hauling wood, mixing mortar, scrubbing soot from salvageable furniture. She learned the names of every tenant who came back, every worker who stayed. She listened to their stories, their worries, their hopes. And slowly, they stopped seeing her as the outsider, the placeholder, the woman who'd caused all the trouble. They started seeing her as one of them. Bess was the first to say it out loud. "You're different now," she said one afternoon. They were replanting the garden, what was left of it, and their hands were black with dirt. "How so?" Leora asked. "You're here, really here, not just going through the motions." Bess glanced at her. "You belong now." Leora smiled. "Took long enough." "Better late than never." That night at dinner, they were eating in the kitchen now, the dining hall still under repair. Elias raised his glass. "To survival," he said, "and to the woman who saved us all." "I didn't save anyone," Leora protested. "You saved Thomas," Mrs. Callan said. "You saved the estate. You saved him." She nodded at Elias. "Whether you want credit or not, you earned it." The staff raised their glasses, echoing the toast. And Leora, sitting there surrounded by people who'd once whispered about her, felt something settle in her chest. Acceptance. She'd fought for it, bled for it, nearly died for it, but she'd won it. Spring came slowly to Thornridge, but when it arrived, it brought new life. The West Wing was finished, not identical to what it had been, but solid and strong. The stable was rebuilt, better than before. The garden Leora had been nursing back to health burst into bloom, filling the courtyard with color and scent. And the tenants came back. Not all of them, some had settled elsewhere, found new lives, but enough. Enough to make the estate feel whole again. One morning, Leora woke to find Elias already up, standing at the window overlooking the cliffs. She joined him, slipping her hand into his. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I almost lost this," he said. "All of it, because I was too proud to admit what I wanted." "And what did you want?" He looked down at her, his eyes warm. "You, just you." She leaned into him. "You have me." "I know." He kissed the top of her head. "I'm not letting go." "Good." They stood there together, watching the sun rise over the sea, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Thornridge, Leora felt like she was exactly where she belonged. Not because someone had put her there, but because she'd fought to stay. And that made all the difference. And that made all the difference. But difference didn't mean easy. It never did. The weeks after the fire blurred together in a haze of sawdust and sweat and endless back-breaking work. Leora's hands developed calluses on top of calluses. Her back ached from lifting beams and hauling stone. Her dresses, what few she had left, were permanently stained with dirt and paint and things she couldn't identify. She'd never been happier. There was something deeply satisfying about rebuilding with her own hands, about watching walls rise from ash, about seeing the estate transform not into what it had been, but into something new, something better. Elias worked beside her most days, sleeves rolled up, covered in the same grime and exhaustion. They didn't talk much while they worked. There was no breath for it, but the silence between them had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full. Full of understanding and shared purpose, and something that felt dangerously close to contentment. One afternoon, 3 months after the fire, Leora was on a ladder painting the trim in what would become the new library when she heard voices below. "Mrs. Thornridge?" She looked down. 2 women stood in the doorway, both strangers, both dressed in the kind of fine clothes that marked them as gentry. "Yes?" Leora climbed down, wiping paint-stained hands on her already ruined apron. The older of the two women, tall, silver-haired, with sharp eyes that missed nothing, studied her with open curiosity. "I'm Lady Hartwell. This is my daughter, Margaret. We're neighbors to the south. We heard about the fire and wanted to offer our assistance." Leora blinked, surprised. "That's very kind, but we're managing—" "I'm sure you are," Lady Hartwell interrupted smoothly. "But we also heard some rather interesting stories about how you ran into a burning building to save a child, how you confronted Lord Ashford, how you've been working alongside your servants to rebuild." She paused. "Forgive my bluntness, but you're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone softer, weaker, the kind of woman who'd crumble under pressure." Lady Hartwell's expression shifted into something that might have been approval. "But you're still standing, and from what I can see, you're not just standing, you're leading." Leora glanced down at her paint-stained dress, her dirty hands, her scuffed boots. "I'm not sure I'd call this leading." "I would," Margaret said quietly. She was younger than Leora, maybe 20, with kind eyes and a gentle voice. "What you've done, choosing to stay, choosing to fight, that takes courage, real courage." "Or stubbornness," Leora said. Lady Hartwell laughed, sharp and genuine. "In my experience, there's not much difference between the two." She glanced around the room, taking in the half-finished shelves, the new windows, the fresh paint. "You're rebuilding more than just a house, aren't you?" "I suppose we are." "Good." Lady Hartwell pulled an envelope from her bag, handing it to Leora. "This is an invitation to a gathering at our estate in 2 weeks. All the neighboring families will be there. We'd like you and your husband to attend." Leora stared at the envelope like it might bite her. "Why?" "Because we want to meet the woman who stared down Lord Ashford and lived to tell about it," Margaret said with a small smile. "And because you're part of this community now, whether you plan to be or not." Lady Hartwell nodded. "The fire changed things. People are talking, not about scandal anymore, about resilience, about what it means to actually fight for something instead of just protecting what you already have." She met Leora's eyes. "You've earned respect. It's time you claimed it." Before Leora could respond, they were gone, sweeping out of the room as quickly as they'd arrived. Leora stood there, holding the invitation, her heart pounding. Elias appeared in the doorway. "Who was that?" "Lady Hartwell and her daughter." "And?" Leora handed him the invitation. He read it, his eyebrows rising. "They want us at a social gathering," he said slowly. "That's unexpected. Is it a trap?" "Probably." He looked at her. "Do you want to go?" Leora thought about it, about the whispers that had followed her through the market, about the servants who'd pitied her, about all the times she'd felt invisible, worthless, temporary. "Yes," she said. "I do." "Then we'll go." "Even if it's a disaster?" Elias smiled, crooked and warm. "Especially if it's a disaster. We've survived worse." But the gathering at Hartwell Manor was both better and worse than Leora had imagined. Better because people actually spoke to her, acknowledged her, asked questions about the rebuild, about the fire, about how she was managing. Some of it felt genuine. Some of it felt like curiosity dressed up as concern, but at least they were looking at her. Worse because Lord Ashford was there. She saw him across the room, talking with a cluster of older men, his expression carefully neutral. When their eyes met, he didn't look away, just nodded once, brief and cold. "Ignore him," Elias murmured, his hand at the small of her back. "I'm trying." "Try harder." Lady Hartwell swept over, all gracious smiles and sharp intelligence. "Mrs. Thornridge, you must meet Lady Pemberton. She's been dying to hear about your garden restoration." And just like that, Leora was pulled into conversation after conversation. Women asking about her methods for coaxing plants back to life in harsh coastal soil. Men asking Elias about rebuilding strategies and fire prevention. It was exhausting and overwhelming and strangely validating. She was halfway through explaining her composting technique to an elderly woman who seemed genuinely interested when she felt eyes on her again. She looked up. Ashford was watching her. Not with hostility exactly. More like assessment. She excused herself, moving toward him before she could lose her nerve. "Lord Ashford." "Mrs. Thornridge." He inclined his head. "You're looking well. Considering. Considering you tried to destroy my life? His mouth twitched. I see you've lost none of your directness. Why would I? It's gotten me this far. Ashford studied her for a moment, then gestured to a quieter corner of the room. May I speak with you, privately? Leora glanced at Elias. He was watching, tense, and ready to intervene, but he didn't move, trusting her to handle it. She nodded. They stepped out onto a terrace overlooking Hartwell's gardens. The evening was cool, the sky streaked with pink and gold. For a moment, neither of them spoke. I owe you an apology, Ashford said finally. A real one, not the half measures I gave before. Leora turned to look at him. Why now? Because I've been watching you these past months, the way you've rebuilt, the way your people look at you, the way you've turned disaster into something. He paused, searching for words, something meaningful. And I realized I was wrong. About what? About you. About your worth. About what kind of woman deserves to stand beside a man like Thornridge. He met her eyes. You're not nobody, Mrs. Thornridge. You never were. I just couldn't see it. Leora's throat tightened. That doesn't undo what you did. No, it doesn't, but it's a start. He pulled something from his pocket, a folded document. This is the deed to the southern farmland that borders Thornridge. I'm transferring it to your husband. No strings, no conditions. Consider it restitution for the damage I caused. Leora stared at the document. Why? Because a child almost died because of my pride. Because I let my ego dictate my actions instead of my conscience. And because, he paused, because you remind me of my late wife. She had that same fire, that same refusal to break. I tried to snuff it out of you, and I was wrong to do it. I don't know what to say. Say you'll accept it. Let me make this right, even if it's only a fraction of what I owe. Leora took the deed, her hands trembling slightly. Thank you. Ashford nodded. For what it's worth, Thornridge is a lucky man, luckier than he deserves. I'll tell him you said so. Please don't. But he was almost smiling. When Leora returned inside, Elias was waiting, his expression tight with barely controlled tension. What did he want? He asked. Leora handed him the deed. Elias unfolded it, read it, then looked at her with something close to shock. This is half again what we lost in Tenant Farms. This is restitution, Leora said, and an apology. You got Lord Ashford to apologize. Apparently I'm more persuasive than I thought. Elias pulled her into his arms, right there in the middle of Lady Hartwell's drawing room, and kissed her, hard and thorough and completely inappropriate for polite company. Someone gasped. Someone else laughed. Leora didn't care. When they broke apart, she was smiling. Let's go home, Elias said. Best idea you've had all night, Bob. Summer arrived with a vengeance, bringing heat that baked the cliffs and turned the sea a brilliant, impossible blue. The reconstruction was nearly complete. Just finishing touches left, details that would take weeks but didn't require the constant grinding effort of before. Leora found herself with time. Actual time, to sit and think and breathe. It felt strange. One morning, she was in the new garden, properly planted now, with herbs and vegetables and even some flowers, when Mrs. Callan found her. There's someone here to see you, the older woman said. A young woman. Says she's from the village. Leora stood, brushing dirt from her hands. Did she give a name? Anne Fletcher. Leora didn't recognize the name, but she followed Mrs. Callan inside anyway. The young woman waiting in the entry hall was maybe 18, thin and nervous, twisting her hands together. When she saw Leora, she dropped into an awkward curtsy. Mrs. Thornridge, thank you for seeing me. Of course. What can I do for you? Anne took a shaky breath. I heard people in the village have been talking about how you saved Thomas during the fire, about how you've been working with the servants, treating them like equals. And I hoped, maybe you could help me. Help you with what? I want to learn to read, Anne said in a rush. I work at the tavern in town, and I'm good with numbers, but I can't read. And I heard you have a library now, and I thought maybe, if you had time, you could teach me. Leora blinked, surprised. You want me to teach you? If you're willing, I can work. I can help in the garden or the kitchen or wherever you need. I want to learn. Leora looked at this girl, standing in her entry hall with hope and fear written all over her face, and made a decision. Come tomorrow afternoon, she said, 2 o'clock, and bring anyone else from the village who wants to learn. Anne's face lit up. Really? Really? Thank you. Thank you so much. After she left, Mrs. Callan raised an eyebrow. You're starting a school now? Why not? Leora said. We have the space, we have the books, and apparently we have people who want to learn. You'll have 12 girls here within the week. Good. Mrs. Callan shook her head, but she was smiling. You're going to turn this place upside down. Hasn't it been upside down since I arrived? Fair point. Mrs. Callan was right. By the end of the week, Leora had 8 students, girls from the village and the tenant farms, ranging in age from 14 to 25. They came in the afternoons, eager and nervous and desperately hungry for knowledge. Leora taught them to read using the books from the library. She taught them arithmetic using household accounts. She taught them about plants and soil and how to make things grow in impossible conditions. And slowly, without quite meaning to, she built something new. A community of women who'd been invisible, just like she'd been. Women who wanted more than what they'd been given. Women who refused to accept that their circumstances defined their worth. Elias watched from a distance, amused and proud in equal measure. You're starting a revolution, he told her one evening. I'm teaching people to read. The same thing. Is it? In this world, yes. He pulled her close, kissing her temple. You're changing things, Leora, whether you mean to or not. She leaned into him. Is that a problem? No. It's one of the things I love most about you. The real test came in autumn, when the regional council convened. It was an annual gathering of all the estate holders and landowners, a chance to discuss shared concerns, settle disputes, and generally posture at each other. Elias had to attend. It was expected. And this year, for the first time, he brought Leora. Are you sure about this? She asked as their carriage approached the meeting hall. I'm not exactly popular. You're more popular than you think, Elias said. And even if you weren't, I want you there. You're my partner in everything. The meeting hall was packed. Every major family in the region had sent representatives. And when Leora walked in beside Elias, every conversation stopped. She kept her chin up, her hand steady on Elias's arm, and refused to let them see her sweat. Lady Hartwell caught her eye from across the room and nodded, approving. Lord Ashford, standing near the front, did the same. The meeting itself was tedious, hours of discussion about trade routes and tax assessments and water rights. Leora sat beside Elias, trying to follow along, trying not to let her attention drift. Then someone brought up the fire. Significant damage to the Thornridge estate, a man she didn't recognize was saying, raises questions about stability, about management, about whether Thornridge should retain his seat on this council. Elias's jaw tightened. The fire was arson, not mismanagement. Still, the fact remains, Lady Hartwell interrupted, standing, that Thornridge lost half his property to a deliberate attack and rebuilt it in less than 6 months. That takes competence, resilience, exactly the kind of qualities we need on this council. Hear, hear, someone said from the back. The man who'd raised the objection sputtered. But the scandal! What scandal? Lady Hartwell's voice was ice. A man chose to honor his marriage vows. A woman chose to stay and fight for her home. Where's the scandal in that? Silence. Then Lord Ashford stood. The room held its breath. Lady Hartwell is right, he said quietly. Thornridge made the right choice. And his wife, Mrs. Thornridge, has proven herself to be an asset not just to his estate, but to this entire region. She's started education programs for women who've never had access to learning. She's rebuilt relationships with tenant farmers. She's demonstrated leadership under impossible circumstances. He paused. If anything, Thornridge's position on this council should be strengthened, not questioned. The silence stretched. Then someone started clapping. Then another. Then the whole room erupted in applause. Leora sat there, stunned, as person after person stood, acknowledging her, acknowledging them, acknowledging what they'd built. Elias squeezed her hand. I told you, he murmured. You're changing things. I didn't do anything, she whispered back. You did everything. They celebrated that night back at Thornridge with the staff and the students and anyone else who wanted to come. Mrs. Callan allowed wine to be served. Bess played fiddle. People danced in the courtyard under the stars. Lyora stood on the terrace, watching, and felt something settle deep in her chest. Home. This was home. Not because someone had given it to her, but because she'd built it, brick by brick, choice by choice, fire and ash and all. Elias joined her, 2 glasses of wine in hand. He passed her one. To survival, he said, echoing his toast from months ago. To more than survival, Lyora corrected. To actually living. They clinked glasses. Below, someone called for a dance. Elias set down his glass and offered his hand. Dance with me? I'm terrible at dancing. So am I. We'll be terrible together. She laughed and took his hand. They danced in the courtyard, surrounded by people who'd become family, under a sky full of stars. And for the first time in her life, Lyora felt like she was exactly where she belonged. Not because it was easy, but because it was hers. Winter came again, as it always did. But this time, Lyora wasn't afraid of it. She and Elias spent long evenings in the newly rebuilt library, sitting by the fire, reading or talking, or just being together. The students kept coming, even through the cold, eager to learn. The estate flourished. The tenants stayed. The community grew. One evening, Elias looked up from the book he was reading and said, I never thanked you. For what? For staying, for fighting, for not giving up on me when you had every reason to. Lyora set down her own book. You gave me a reason to stay. Did I? You chose me, she said simply. When it mattered, when it cost you, you chose me. That's everything. He crossed to where she sat, kneeling beside her chair. I choose you again. Every time. In every life. Good. Because you're stuck with me now. Best thing that's ever happened to me. He kissed her, slow and sweet, and Lyora wrapped her arms around his neck, holding on. Outside, snow began to fall, soft and gentle, covering the cliffs and the sea and the house in white. Inside, the fire crackled. The house was warm. And 2 people who'd once been strangers, who'd once been nothing to each other, held each other close and chose, again and again, to stay. Years later, when people told the story of Lyora Vale and Elias Thornridge, they told it differently depending on who was doing the telling. Some said it was a love story, a tale of 2 people who found each other against impossible odds and built something beautiful from ash and ruin. Some said it was a cautionary tale, a reminder that pride and power could destroy as easily as they could build, and that true strength came from knowing when to bend. Some said it was a story about survival, about what it took to endure in a harsh world, to hold on when everything said to let go. But Lyora, when asked, said it was simpler than all of that. It's a story about choice, she'd say, usually while tending her garden or teaching her students or sitting beside Elias on the terrace overlooking the cliffs, about choosing to be seen instead of invisible, about choosing to fight instead of fade, about choosing each other when the world said we shouldn't. And would you choose it again? Someone would inevitably ask. She'd look at Elias, older now, grayer, but still looking at her like she hung the moon, and smile. Every single time. Because that was the truth. Not that their life was perfect, not that the struggles ended, not that everything was easy, but that they'd chosen it. Together. And in a world that tried to make them both into things they weren't, a cold master, an invisible wife, they'd chosen to be human instead, flawed and messy and real, and that, Lyora decided, was worth more than any fortune, any title, any perfect story could ever be. She'd been a placeholder once, temporary, forgettable, but she'd become permanent, unforgettable. Not because someone had decided she mattered, but because she'd decided it herself. And once you made that choice, once you decided you were worth fighting for, everything else followed. The house rebuilt itself, the garden bloomed, the community flourished, and 2 people who'd started on cold ground built something warm enough to last a lifetime. Thornridge still stood on the cliffs, battered by wind and sea and time, but it stood stronger now, rebuilt, renewed, a house reborn. just like the woman who'd refused to let it fall, just like the man who'd learned that control meant nothing without connection, just like the life they'd built together, brick by stubborn brick, in the face of storms that should have destroyed them. They'd survived, and more than that, they'd lived. Really, truly lived. And in the end, that was the only story that mattered. The years that followed brought changes neither of them could have predicted. The school Leora had started, almost by accident, with one nervous girl asking to learn, grew into something far bigger than a few afternoon lessons in the library. Word spread through the villages, through the tenant farms, through the network of women who cleaned houses and worked fields and raised children and dreamed of something more. Within 2 years, Leora had 30 students. Within 5, she had to hire 2 additional teachers just to keep up with demand. "You're going to need a proper building," Elias told her one morning, watching as women of all ages crowded into the library, perching on chairs and windowsills and the floor itself. "The house can't hold them all." "I know," Leora said, but her voice was distant. She was already planning, already seeing it in her mind, a school building, purpose-built, with real classrooms and desks and books for everyone. "How much would it cost?" she asked. Elias did the calculations, his brow furrowing. "More than we have readily available, but we could take a loan, or—" He paused. "I could sell the northern timber rights. That would cover it." "You love that land. I love you more, and I love what you're building." He looked at her seriously. "This matters, Leora. What you're doing, giving these women knowledge, giving them power over their own lives, this is going to change everything, not just for them, for their daughters, for generations." So they built the school. It took 1.5 years, and every penny they could scrape together, and donations from families like the Hartwells, who believed in what Leora was doing. When it finally opened, a sturdy stone building with large windows and a slate roof and room for 60 students, the entire region turned out for the ceremony. Leora stood in front of the building, her hands shaking as she cut the ribbon, and looked out at the crowd. At the women who'd been her first students, now helping to teach others. At the girls who'd never dreamed they could learn to read, now devouring books like they were starving. At Elias, standing off to the side with a smile that made her heart hurt in the best way. "This is for everyone who was told they didn't matter," she said, her voice carrying across the crowd. "Everyone who is invisible. Everyone who is temporary. You matter. You always did. And this—" She gestured to the building behind her. "This is proof." The applause was deafening. But success brought its own complications. Not everyone approved of what Leora was doing. There were whispers in the more conservative circles that she was overstepping, that educating women beyond their station was dangerous, that she was disrupting the natural order of things. "Let them whisper," Leora told Elias when he brought it up. "They whispered about me before too. I survived. This is different. They're organizing. There's talk of bringing it before the regional council, trying to shut down the school." Leora's jaw tightened. "Let them try." The confrontation came 3 months later at another council meeting. A coalition of older landowners, men who'd built their fortunes on keeping people in their place, formally objected to the school's existence. "It's creating unrealistic expectations," one of them argued. "These women should be focused on their proper duties, not filling their heads with ideas above their station." "What ideas would those be?" Leora asked, standing. She'd been granted permission to speak, a concession Elias had fought hard for. "The ability to read a contract before they sign it, to do mathematics well enough to know if they're being cheated, to understand their own rights under the law?" "It's unnatural," another man said. "Women aren't meant for that kind of learning." "Then how do you explain the fact that my students consistently outperform their male counterparts in every subject we teach?" Leora's voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. "How do you explain the fact that businesses in town actively recruit my graduates because they're more reliable, more competent, more trustworthy than workers who can't read or write?" Silence. Lord Ashford stood. He was older now, his hair completely white, but his voice still carried authority. "I think," he said carefully, "that we're witnessing something we don't fully understand, and rather than embrace it, we're afraid of it." He looked at the men who'd objected. "But fear is a poor reason to deny people opportunity. Mrs. Thornridge's school has produced shopkeepers, bookkeepers, teachers, and skilled laborers. It's strengthened our economy. reduced crime, increased literacy rates across the entire region. He paused. If that's unnatural, then perhaps we need to reconsider what we think of as natural. The vote, when it came, was close. But the school survived. Barely. That night, Leora sat in their bedroom, staring at nothing, her hands clenched in her lap. "They almost won," she said quietly. Elias sat beside her, taking her hands in his. But they didn't. This time. What about next time? Then we fight again. I'm tired of fighting. I know. He pulled her close. But you're also good at it, and what you're fighting for, it's worth the exhaustion. Leora leaned into him, closing her eyes. Sometimes I wonder if it would have been easier to just stay invisible, to accept being temporary. Would it have been? She thought about it, really thought about it, about the woman she'd been when she first arrived at Thornridge, scared, alone, convinced she didn't matter. No, she said finally. It would have been easier. But I wouldn't have been me. Exactly. The years continued to pass. The school thrived despite opposition. Elias's hair went gray at the temples, then completely silver. Leora found her first white hair and laughed about it, though privately it made her feel strange, like time was moving faster than she'd realized. They never had children. It simply didn't happen, despite wanting it. For a while it had been a source of quiet grief. Another way Leora felt like she'd failed at being what a wife should be. But Elias had held her through those dark nights and said, "You are enough, just as you are. Children or no children, you are enough." And eventually she'd believed him. Besides, they had the students, dozens of them, over the years, girls who called Leora ma'am, but looked at her like she was family. Women who came back years later with their own daughters, wanting to give them the same opportunities they'd had. One evening, a former student named Catherine arrived at Thornridge with a baby on her hip and determination in her eyes. "Mrs. Thornridge," she said, "I need to ask you something." "Of course, come in." They sat in the library, Leora's favorite room still, after all these years, and Catherine took a deep breath. "I want to open a school in the next county, like yours, but for even more girls. And I want to know if you'll help me." Leora stared at her. I want to do what you did. I want to give other women what you gave me. A chance." Catherine's eyes were bright. "I've saved money. I have a location. I just need advice. And maybe, if you're willing, your blessing." Leora's throat tightened. "You don't need my blessing to do something good." "Maybe not, but I want it anyway." Leora reached across and took Catherine's hand. "Then you have it, all of it. And whatever help you need, you'll get it." Catherine smiled, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for everything. You changed my life." "No," Leora said gently. "You changed your own life. I just gave you the tools." But watching Catherine leave, watching her walk out into the world ready to build something of her own, Leora felt something she hadn't felt in years. Pride. Not in herself, though that was there too, but in what she'd started, in the ripples spreading outward, farther than she could see. She'd wanted to matter, and now she did. Not because she'd married well or survived a fire or confronted powerful men, though she'd done all of those things, but because she'd given other people the chance to matter too. On their 20th anniversary, Elias took her back to the cliffs where they'd stood that morning after she'd tried to leave. The wind was just as brutal as it had always been, the sea just as wild, but Leora didn't mind. She'd learned to love the harshness of this place, to see beauty in its refusal to be gentle. "Do you ever regret it?" Elias asked, his arm around her shoulders. "Staying here? Choosing this life?" Leora thought about all the years, the fights and the failures and the small, hard-won victories, the students who'd succeeded and the ones who'd struggled, the nights of exhaustion and doubt and wondering if any of it mattered. "Not for a second," she said. "Not even when it's hard?" "Especially when it's hard." She turned to face him. "Easy things don't change you. They don't make you stronger. They don't teach you who you really are." Elias smiled, touching her face with a gentleness that still surprised her sometimes. 20 years, and he could still make her feel like the most important person in the world. "You're extraordinary," he said quietly. "You know that? I'm stubborn." Same thing. She laughed, and he kissed her there on the cliffs, with the wind trying to tear them apart and failing, because they'd been tested by worse. They'd survived fire and scandal and people who wanted to break them. They'd survived their own mistakes and fears and the thousand small ways love could go wrong. And they were still standing, still choosing each other, still building something worth fighting for. Below them, Thornridge stood solid and strong, its windows glowing with warm light. Smoke rose from the chimneys. Voices drifted up from the courtyard where some of the staff were finishing evening chores. Home. Not perfect. Not easy. But theirs. Leora leaned into Elias, watching the sun set over the sea, and thought about the girl she'd been. The one who'd arrived here terrified and alone, convinced she was temporary. That girl was gone. In her place stood a woman who knew her worth, who'd built a legacy, who'd taken a house made of cold stone and distance and turned it into something warm enough to last. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For seeing me, when I couldn't see myself." Elias held her closer. "Thank you for staying, for teaching me what it means to actually live instead of just survive." They stood there together as the stars began to appear, one by one, and Leora felt a peace she'd never imagined possible. She'd been nobody once, a placeholder, a convenience, temporary. But she'd become someone, not by changing who she was, but by refusing to disappear. And in the end, that was the greatest rebellion of all, to be seen, to be valued, to matter. Not because someone granted her permission, but because she'd claimed it for herself. And once claimed, it could never be taken away. The wind howled, the sea crashed against the cliffs. The world remained as harsh and unforgiving as it had always been. But Leora Thornridge stood firm, unbreakable, permanent.